We're going to be getting into the fourth president of the United States, James Madison. Now, during James Madison's presidency, you're going to see a war happen, and this war is a result of all of these foreign issues that have gone on during George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson's presidency. So, the causes of the War of 1812 are going to be the war hawks that were settlers in the West. They believed that the British were trying to cause natives to rise up against the United States citizens. And they weren't entirely wrong by this. The British kind of worked under the table, along with a lot of European powers, to kind of undermine American settlers in different territories that weren't the 13 original colonies. So these natives at this time also started encouraging each other to not take on this European culture, to not act quote unquote white, to keep their traditional clothing, to keep their traditional culture, and to not conform to what European settlers wanted them to do. During this time, Native Americans started to take on this quote white culture. They started dressing like Europeans. They started owning slaves. They started participating in the economy that the European descendants were participating in, and they were kind of losing themselves in the process. Impressment was when British sailors, British Navy ships, were stopping cargo ships and basically imprisoning people and making them serve in the British Navy. So imagine being on a ship and your job was a tradesman, and your job was to take goods from one country to the other. Excuse me. But the British would stop you. The British would stop these ships. They would jump on board, and they would basically say, you, and you are deserters of the military. Your punishment is you're going to come with us, and you're going to continue out your sentence. You're going to serve out your term, and you're going to serve on this Navy ship. When they were born in America, they had never been in Great Britain, but these British sailors were trying to say that these tradesmen were deserters of the British Navy. So, war hawks, on your notes, please write whether you believe this is a domestic affair or a foreign affair. And impressments, on your notes, please write whether you think this is a domestic or foreign affair. Which pillar of the United States security do you place impressment under? Is it going to be border security? Is it going to be trade security? Or is it going to be a conflict? I'm only grading the Y. Battle at sea. The USS Constitution is a U.S. ship. That's what USS stands for. The British, it defeated the British, and it was nicknamed Old Ironsides. The reason why it was nicknamed Old Ironsides is because it had several cannon holes through the ship, and it survived, and it still is afloat. You can still see it in the Boston Navy Yard today. Highly recommended if you ever get the chance. It's super awesome to see a ship that was built, 200, 300 years ago. It's crazy that it survived this long. So, battles in the Great Lakes region. Remember, this is the Great Lakes region. You have the Great Lake Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. And then you have New York State and Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana territory. This right here, this is where the war hawks would have been. A lot of these battles, you see all of these little numbers, they're all battles that occur on the Great Lakes. And the reason why is because this is Canada. This is British territory still. And then of course the United States, they were both at war, and they're literally in some places there's not even a lake between them. So this is where a lot of battles are going to start happening. William Henry Harrison was an American commander who fought in this area. It was because of him that the British did not get to New York. They tried to get to New York City to attack our major trade center at the time, and still is our major trade city, but they were unsuccessful because of William Henry Harrison. Just something interesting, and this is William Henry Harrison. Just something interesting in this area, the Great Lakes area, the Northwest. It's called the Northwest Territory. In that area, slavery was illegal, but we still had slaves, even though it was illegal. We still had some slaves up in here, and this is where the British really start kind of taking over and freeing United States slaves. The burning of Washington, D.C. So Dolly Madison is, at this time, the First Lady. She's James Madison's wife. And what happens is they're in the White House, they're just chilling, they're maxing, relaxing, all cool, and someone comes in. One of his soldiers comes in and says, "The British are coming, they're burning down the city, we need to leave." James Madison gets up, runs out of the room, gets on his horse, and leaves. He leaves his kids, he leaves his wife, he leaves the rest of his staff, he just goes. He goes to Virginia. Dolly Madison stays behind. She's the brave woman that saves a lot of our history. She saves portraits of presidents. She saves silver. She saves all these important papers. And it's not just her. It's all of her ladies in waiting. It's all of the maids. It's not the men. It's not the soldiers. It's not the security team. It's the women that save everything. And they were just quite literally left for dead. I mean, they knew that the British wouldn't have killed ladies, but still, the fact that, I mean, if my husband left me while a military was burning down the city, it would not be pretty. So the president's mansion did have to be rebuilt, and that's why it's named the White House, is because they painted over these scorch marks. They painted them white. They also, the only city that they, or the only house, the only building that they left standing was the post office. That was the only federal building they left standing. And because of that, Congress and the president and pretty much every single federal government agency had to meet in the post office to have meetings, because that was the only federal building left. So here's a picture of that. The Star-Spangled Banner. So our national anthem comes from this time. Francis Scott Key is the author of the Star-Spangled Banner. He is actually taken aboard a ship. He's kidnapped. Well, I mean, he's taken prisoner on a British ship. He's on the ship, and he's messing around with the captain of the ship. The captain and the first mate and all of the higher-ups of the British Navy were goofing around, and they were actually getting a little bit drunk. They had been drinking. So he was messing around with them, and he was kind of torturing them, and he was drinking with them as well. And he started basically kind of threatening them, and it made the Navy mad. It made the British commanders mad. So they threw Francis Scott Key in a dungeon at the bottom of the ship, and he looked out at the window, he looked out the porthole, and he saw a massive United States flag flying while bombs are going off. And this is where you get the quotes, "And the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there." It's based on this war, the War of 1812. So the Creek War is another little internal domestic issue that's going on during the War of 1812. Like I said, the British were kind of teaming up with these Native Americans, and the Creeks are no exception to that. They were kind of teaming up with the British, and they were kind of attacking the southern portion of the United States. Well, Andrew Jackson quote-unquote, defeated them in a series of battles. I say quote because he basically promised them a whole bunch of rewards if they would stop fighting. And then he never followed through on those rewards. So he didn't really defeat them. He just bribed them without giving them a bribe. And then when he becomes president, he kicks them off their land. So we'll talk about that later. So the Treaty of Ghent is signed in 1815. It's the War of 1812. But before word can get to the United States, the Battle of New Orleans happens, because the Treaty of Ghent is signed in Europe, New Orleans is in the New World. It takes about 4 or 5 months to get the news over here because they didn't have cell phones. So Andrew Jackson works his way through the South and he gets to New Orleans. Well, the British forces were trying to take over New Orleans. Again, it's at the mouth of the Mississippi River. If you control New Orleans, you control all the trade in the United States, in the western United States especially. So he stops the British from taking over New Orleans, which is great for us. It was something like 500 to 700 Americans that Andrew Jackson had to over 10,000 British soldiers. And he somehow defeated all of these troops. And it was just amazing. It gave him a lot of national fame. It was the last battle of the War of 1812. Again, it was signed after the Treaty of Ghent, but word has not reached the United States. It was a completely unnecessary battle. Part of why it gave him national fame is because he was able to capture or kill every single British commander that was responsible for this battle. This is largely the reason that he was later elected president, is because he was very famous for this battle. So, do you think the War of 1812 was a domestic or a foreign affair? The effects of the War of 1812. America proved its independence for good. Other countries recognized us as independent, which is great. We started getting recognized as a real world power after this. But really what happened, the most important thing that happened, at this time, Great Britain was our sole supporter when it came to buying guns from. We did not have manufacturing here in the United States, at least not on a larger scale as large of a scale as Great Britain. So we had to buy guns from Great Britain. Well, if you're in a war against somebody, are you going to sell them weapons? Absolutely not. And once we started the War of 1812, Great Britain stopped selling us our guns, and then we kind of panicked. Like, whoa, we're not going to have weapons if we go to war with Great Britain again. We really need to start producing our own guns, our own food, our own clothing, etc. And this is when Americans really stepped up and started figuring out we need to open some factories here. We need to open our own industry. So James Monroe's presidency. James Monroe is the 5th president of the United States, right after Madison. The Adams-Onis Treaty happens during his presidency. It's a treaty with Spain that gave the United States control over Florida. The Monroe Doctrine is a speech or letter from President Monroe that stated that European nations were no longer allowed to colonize in the Western Hemisphere or the Americas. He gave this speech to Congress during his presidency, and it also agreed that the U.S., in response to European countries no longer colonizing in the Americas, the U.S. would stay neutral in all European wars. So previously we had gotten involved in between a war between Great Britain and France. Now we're not going to do that anymore. The Missouri Compromise. Around this time, so let's go back a little bit to the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, I said that Great Britain really started getting into our plantations and just releasing slaves, like on mass amounts. They were just releasing thousands and thousands of slaves. Every single slave they could, they released it. They did not do this for moral reasons, as much as I wish they did. They did not do this because they thought slavery was bad, because slavery was still legal in Great Britain at this time. They did this because they knew it irritated us. They did this because they knew the President of the United States was a slave owner. They did this because they knew all of the higher-ups in the United States at this time all had slaves. They had slaves in the White House at this time. Right before the War of 1812, the United States had started to free slaves. Each state was kind of starting to release slaves. Like after an owner would die, they'd release their slaves. Once the state got below a certain number of slaves, they just made it all illegal, and the owners could move to a different state, or they could release their slaves, either one. After the War of 1812, because the British started releasing our slaves at a mass number, we got really fed up with it and we started getting stricter. And by we, I mean the United States. The United States got stricter on slave control. Um, it started being a much bigger deal that, oh my gosh, people are going to take away our slaves. So the slave owners, who were very powerful at this time, started making rules about not allowing slave releasing. So, like, states would put in effect, you could not release your slaves even after you died. It had to be inherited to your next of kin or whatever. So, because of this, 2 new states were admitted to the Union. The state of Missouri was admitted. They had enough people, according to the Northwest Ordinance, so they had to be admitted into the Union. The trouble with that is that Missouri was a slave state, and these northern states were very powerful. They had started releasing slaves and outlawing slaves. And when they saw that Missouri was going to be added, Missouri is a slave state, well, there's going to be 2 more senators added to Congress that are going to be slave owners. And they did not like this. They didn't think it was fair. They didn't think that they would be able to hold off any slave laws on their own. So, according to the Missouri Compromise, now not only Missouri was added, they created the state of Maine. Maine was going to be a free state, and then once you added Maine and Missouri, there were 2 free state senators added and 2 slave state senators added. So the power balanced out. And Congressman Henry Clay is known as the great compromiser of this decision. He'll be mentioned here in a minute, too. The American system, again, written by Henry Clay, the great compromiser, this set funds, tax dollars, the United States tax dollars that were going to go to transportation, to creating roads. The national road is what he called it, along with bridges and other infrastructure that the United States really needed to help trade. The era of good feelings. I need you to add this to your notes. Basically, the era of good feelings were patriotic feelings that were associated with the United States after the War of 1812. These people were very, very proud to be American. It tends to happen during any war. After 9/11, it happened really, really not bad. I don't want to say bad, but it happened a lot. People were a lot more patriotic. They were proud to be American because they came together and they banded together against a foreign power, against a foreign threat. But this era of good feelings happened during Monroe's presidency. And that's all I got for you today.